Okay, thank you everyone for coming today. It falls to me to welcome everyone. You'll notice that for our Wednesday ESE seminar, we're in a much bigger room than we usually are. The reason for that is happening at Caltech this week is a small workshop being supported by the Linde Center. It'll be the first of a series of these workshops that will be held over the next year or so. And the topic of this workshop has been Southern Ocean Dynamics and Biogeochemistry. We've had a few public events, thanks to those who came to the introductory lectures on Monday. And it's been very stimulating and productive time over the rest of the week. Now, associated with this, we wanted to have a public lecture, and we were very lucky to get Professor Ralph Keeling up to us from Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And I could read through his biography for you, but Paul and Ralph were grad students together at Harvard in 1988. Well, that's when, at least when Ralph got his PhD. And Paul said... right. And so, yeah, I was going to have Paul do the embarrassing stories, but apparently I've already done that.
So Ralph and I, we weren't the longest tenured grad students there. There were others, but let's just say it was a great place to be, and it was hard to leave. And so both of us spent a long time at working with Jim Anderson at Harvard. But to go back a bit further, in 1953, Ralph's father, Dave Keeling, came to Caltech, and he came here to work with the new Department of Geochemistry. He was working with Sam Epstein and with Harrison Brown, and he was tasked with a rather silly idea of trying to understand the carbonate dissolution chemistry of groundwaters, and realized he had to figure out how to measure carbon dioxide in air, which amazingly in 1953, there was some debate about actually what its concentration was. And so he worked here and developed a technique to measure carbon dioxide, and then quickly realized that this was going to be an incredibly important measurement to understand the oceans, the atmosphere, and our interactions with it. And so he worked really hard. He went to Scripps and established the first really precise record of carbon dioxide in atmospheric in air. And he taught his son that this was an important thing to do. So he did. So Ralph came to Harvard, and his advisor Jim Anderson was my advisor. Basically did the same thing. He said, well, here's a lot of cool things you can work on. And Ralph toiled away a little bit at those, and then realized that he wanted to make a measurement that would really change the way we think about ourselves, the land, the ocean, and that he could complement his father's work by measuring oxygen. So, of course, when 1985, we knew how much oxygen was in the air. It was 21%. And of course, that's not the problem. The problem is if you want to actually measure oxygen in order to see those very small changes that are present in atmospheric concentration. And I don't know if Ralph's going to tell us a little bit about why you would do this. But again, it was to establish a record that would tell us about our interactions with the atmosphere and the interactions between the atmosphere and the oceans. And so ever since, he's now maintained an enormous observational record and a strong intellectual presence in the field at Scripps, and we're delighted to have him here today to tell us about that work.
So thank you, Paul. It is a great pleasure to be here. It's also an interesting lineup for me to talk about. As was mentioned, I'm in a meeting on the Southern Ocean, and it's populated with all these heavy hitters. And here I am giving a public lecture, and guess what? They're all sitting there, ready to go to bat. So I've got an interesting charge. And I hope I can keep all sides of this audience engaged, because there's some challenges in speaking at these different levels. So yes, I'll be telling you about some of the work involving carbon dioxide and oxygen. The story, though, has sort of evolved into thinking about how the Earth works. I'm not particularly going to focus very much on the Southern Ocean, although I have one little insert in the end, especially for the heavy hitters, that actually touches a little bit on ocean imbalances that has to do with that. But mostly I'm going to give a story about my perspective on what we're learning about how the Earth behaves by doing these long-term observations of the air. And I kind of have another subtitle to my talk, which is, or how I learned to stop worrying and love the biosphere. So this is tipping the hat to one of my favorite movies. And you see this is a tree growing up with explosive vigor, right? And I don't work alone here. A lot of people have helped on different parts of these talks. These are people in my group in various ways. Paul already told the Caltech story of my dad. I'll just, I slipped this in at the last minute, realizing I couldn't give the talk at Caltech without mentioning this, but Paul already covered. So these are just some slides. This is my father, and in that era, in the Sierras, going on a hike, but he was studying carbon in rivers, so you can imagine him thinking about carbon equilibration. So this is very much in the era. Samples were taken in flasks that looked like this. I was just in John Eiler's lab looking up at the wall. John Eiler's lab, I think, is Sam Epstein's old lab. And there, probably it hasn't left the room, is a flask. Now, this is not one of my father's flasks.
I'm pretty sure that's in my lab right now.
Yeah, no, it isn't. This is in my lab.
I'll be there to get it tomorrow.
But the point is that they have the same origin. This is, it was one geochemical sort of font of these methodologies that is still sort of spread through. We don't mostly do things this way, although I keep using these flasks because they're actually not bad for what we do. Here's a picture of my father playing around with liquid nitrogen. The method he developed at Caltech for measuring CO2 involved liquid nitrogen. That was a new commercial commodity at the time. It had a great property that you could actually free CO2 out of air, so it was a very simple volumetric approach to measuring carbon dioxide. Here he is with this manometer, really an elegant piece of glass. It's still there, belongs in a museum at this point. Here's a slide in Mauna Loa. This is where they went to measure the CO2 in situ, and I'll talk a little bit about this record. And here's the Mauna Loa record. He, of course, measured carbon dioxide in more places at the time, but the record that really stands out is the Mauna Loa record. It's the one place that they put an instrument in the field, an infrared analyzer, calibrated with the manometric method. And this is the record to date. As some of you may have noticed in the news, we went over 400. We had a kind of odometer moment in the carbon dioxide story where we went over, we were the first digit in the concentration flipped over, and a lot of people like that. It kept me busy for a week. So this is what the record looks like. Now, one of the things that was evident early on, and the reason for measuring this, of course, was to understand what would happen if you released fossil fuel into the atmosphere. Would it build up, and how fast would it rise? And early on, it was possible already to compare the growth rate that you actually observe in carbon dioxide with the trend you'd expect from the fossil fuel emitted. And it was clear that the actual rate of increase was smaller than the amount emitted into the atmosphere. So yes, CO2 is rising. It's not exactly clear, though, why it's rising at the rate it's rising at, because it's not tied to something as simple as fossil fuel burning. So what else is going on here is that you have land and the ocean sitting out there. And the land can take up carbon dioxide by photosynthesis. The ocean can take up carbon dioxide mainly because the carbon dioxide can dissolve in water and then react with the carbonate to form bicarbonate. There's a buffering chemistry of the carbon system in seawater. And so some balance of those sink processes could explain the carbon dioxide emitted from fossil fuel that didn't stay in the air. It's going into those reservoirs. Now, from records of fossil fuel burning, you actually know pretty well year to year how much is being burned. And from the increase in the atmosphere, you know how much balance stayed in the air. So just from the CO2 record alone and the fossil fuel record, you know the sum of these two rates. But for a long time, it really wasn't clear what the partitioning was between these two sink processes. And it matters because this sink process is controlled kind of by mixing in the ocean and this buffer chemistry. And so as long as the mixing goes on at a more or less steady rate and you understand this chemistry, you can kind of project how that sink will evolve into the future. On land, if there's a sink process, it's by photosynthesis, completely different mechanistically. The trees are sitting out there in the climate system. They could be changing for all sorts of reasons. So it had very significant mechanistic implications as to the strength of these different processes. So a fair amount of work has gone into trying to quantify these. And what I'm going to do next is just jump to a slide that gives you a synthesis of what the recent partitioning of these sinks is estimated to be. This is from the the latest of the so-called IPCC reports. And here's a table showing the magnitude of fossil fuel emissions. The units here are billions of tons or petagrams of carbon per year. Fossil fuel is up at 7.8. The atmosphere is increasing at slightly more than half the rate of fossil fuel burning at 4. This is just directly tied to how many ppm per year it's going up. You just have to know the volume of the atmosphere. Multiplied by the concentration, you get a number of grams that are increasing in the atmosphere. So we know those two. Those are the ones I said we kind of knew, the gray ones, and then they're shown over here as a bar chart just to give you a visual depiction of these numbers. So we know the atmosphere, we measured that. Fossil fuel burning is pretty well estimated. It's pretty clear that there's additional CO2 being emitted by direct human intervention on land. For example, the clearing of forested land for agriculture causes carbon dioxide to be released. The tilling of soils degrades organic matter in the soil. So we're working the land, and that working process actually causes carbon dioxide to be released. That's an additional source you need to add in. The ocean sink, it's been a lot of work has gone into trying to quantify that, and I'll show some of my own work that relates to that, but let's just take the number. It's estimated about 2.3. And so you combine those, and it doesn't add up. And so this residual sink here is a term that's basically everything you couldn't account for so far. For a while, it was called the missing sink because we didn't really have a mechanism associated with it. It was something that had to be pulling it out. It's pretty clear that this sink, though, is on land because we actually know what the ocean's doing. So this is some kind of photosynthetic land sink. And it's big. So one of the shockers here is that this land is actually somehow soaking up so much carbon. I mean, after all, trees do take up CO2 when they grow. So you say, okay, duh, plants should take up CO2. But the problem is that forests have trees that are dying at the same time trees that are growing. There's a cycle of life. And if the forest is in some kind of balance, you're going to have just as much growth as decay. The system is going to be net zero in terms of its effect on carbon. So for the ecosystems that are not directly perturbed by humans to be soaking up carbon, they have to be out of whack. There's something imbalanced. There's something unnatural going on about land ecosystems that is causing them to soak up carbon. And since the time I sort of joined this academic community or the science community working on this problem, which was in the 1980s, the population of scientists working on land carbon has exploded. It's gone from, I would say, something like 5% of a community of 20 scientists in the 1970s to 90% of a community of thousands at this point. So this is where the big science is going on in carbon right now. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. But it's partly because we don't fully understand what's going on. And it's also because, I'll drop a hint, it's because people think there's money involved in what you do with the land. And it has to do with regulating carbon and putting a price on it. And the land matters. You can see it matters here, it matters there. Okay. So how do we know this? The budget I just described is established because we know fossil fuel burning, we know the atmospheric increase. The land use effect is pretty uncertain in relative terms, but it's small. And so if you can get the ocean sink nailed down, you can get this budget worked out. So how do we know the ocean sink? Or how do we know the land-ocean partitioning? It comes out to the same thing. One way to do it is to look, I'm actually got a slide I talked ahead of myself here. So backing up for a second. That slide gave you a snapshot in the recent period. It turns out you can reconstruct this going back into the past as well. So the same color scheme applies. The atmosphere is this light blue, and the distance between the top and the bottom is the amount of CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. This is a kind of a cumulative plot. It's a flux plot, but they add up one on top of each other. Here's the ocean sink down here. Here's the atmospheric increase. Here's this residual sink. Here's fossil fuel burning. Is this gray wedge here and the land use here. One of the things, so that budget applied to kind of the end of this. How did we know this back in the past? We know it because the atmospheric increase was measured back in the past and then all the way even further back with ice cores. If you know the atmospheric increase, the ocean is just a response to that, so you can actually model the ocean all the way back. The fossil fuel, we have industrial records going back into the 19th century before. The land use has been estimated. So you can run the whole thing at any time over this time period, and that's all that's been done here. But one of the things that's quite interesting to me about this is that when I started, let's say in the mid-'80s, the land use estimates were higher than they are at the end of the record. You see that this curve has gone down a little bit. And if you look at this residual sink at that time, it was almost the same magnitude in the opposite direction as the land use. So even though you can say that the land had to be soaking up carbon, on net it was kind of zero. There was emissions here and sinks over there. And you could imagine that, gee, if only we could get the ocean to take up a little more in the budget, and these people who were estimating land use had just done their numbers a little wrong, the land would kind of drop out as a second order thing. So the land's claim to being a first order contribution to this budget was a bit weak at that time, because it could disappear in the error bars. But what's happened since is that the estimates of land use have gotten better, the number, and it looks like it's trended downward. And while this has trended downward, look at this green curve, this green wedge is still kind of growing. There's a lot of variability here, but it's grown. So the land has really shown its hand in the last decade or so. The land is like, wow, it's emerged from this ghostly thing that might or might not be real to something that's very real and pulling a lot of weight. And so part of the reason we believe this is just how it's trended over time. But the argument still depends on getting the ocean right and the land-ocean partitioning. So that's where my own work on oxygen comes in, along with other people's work. There's other ways to do this. This is one of several ways it kind of gets at the core. So what does oxygen tell us? Well, oxygen is coupled in with carbon in several ways, mainly through combustion and photosynthesis. When you burn fuels, you're taking oxygen out. So when you drive your car, CO2 is coming out the exhaust pipe, oxygen's going in the intake, and the air coming out the exhaust pipe is depleted in oxygen because some of it got used up in burning the fuel. And that's going on globally, leading to depletion in oxygen. Now, in addition, you could have, let's say, if you have a land effect over here, if the land plants are taking up CO2 by photosynthesis, they have to be producing oxygen. That's what photosynthesis does. Or if there's a process in the other direction, like a fire or the plants are decomposing, you take in oxygen, you give out CO2. So there's a very close coupling here between oxygen and carbon. That's because in every case, the carbon is basically moving between gaseous CO2 to some kind of organic matter. You're building organic matter or you're destroying it. There's oxygen involved. The ocean sink doesn't involve organic matter, at least into first order. This is just an inorganic process. So there's no corresponding oxygen flux associated with this. So oxygen basically gives you a different slice at the same processes. And if you can measure fossil fuel burning, if you measure the trend in the atmosphere and oxygen, correct for fossil fuel burning, the main thing you get out as a difference is the land. And this is the net land, I should say, in terms of the earlier budget. It's the sum of it's the difference between this brown and the green is what you get. So in effect, it's giving you the ocean, if you want to think about it. Because if you know the net land, it's the piece that left over has to be the ocean. So it's giving you that. So that's where I was. So this is what I set about to do when I was at Harvard. Now, my father did not encourage me to go into this field. He didn't exactly actively discourage me. He was at some point he seemed to wish that I would become a cook or something ridiculous like that. But he did drop a hint at one point. I was in science, and he would share his science with me. And at one point he just sort of casually mentioned, what we really need is to measure oxygen, because that would solve this problem of the partitioning, which was on the table at the time. And I filed that away into interesting thoughts. And many years later, when I was trying to pick a thesis project, went to Jim Anderson, our advisor, and said, hey, I think I have an idea of how to do this. And what was fantastic, because he didn't kick me out of the room, because it had nothing to do with what was going on in his lab. But he was that kind of professor. He liked things that were ambitious and out there, and he was solidly behind it. So I was really lucky to be in a place where you could sort of take on some big challenge and have the kind of support that you could just barely dream of anywhere else. It was fantastic. Anyway, so I had fun building a method. I'm not going to say too much about that, but it involved interferometry, basically looking at changes in the speed of light, which depends on fractive index, which depends on what's in the gas. And so there was a way to get out a very precise measure. And as Paul said, the big challenge here is that the changes in oxygen are at the same absolute level, parts per million level, as the changes in carbon dioxide. But instead of looking at a change against a background of 300 or 400 parts per million, you're looking at against a background of 200,000 or 200 10,000 parts per million. That is 21%. So you're looking at really tiny relative changes. But with a technique like interferometry, you can really hone in there and get it. And now actually there's half a dozen methods that have been demonstrated to make measurements this precise. So measuring, you have to measure to about 6 significant figures. You can buy a voltmeter that's to 6.5 digits without that much money. This isn't as easy as measuring voltage, but it's not vastly harder than that. Okay. Although it did take me many years. So this is stations where my father was measuring carbon dioxide, and it also includes stations where I've been measuring oxygen concentrations. And I'm not going to get into too much of the granularity of this data. Here's sort of the records of oxygen. Oxygen is decreasing over time. Like carbon dioxide, it's got this seasonal cycle, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But that relates to imbalances between photosynthesis and respiration, seasonally mostly. And some of this data is on the website, of course. So what have we seen relative to fossil fuel burning? So this is a record from one of our stations, Cape Grim, plotted here with these points. Each one is a monthly value, and there's a seasonal cycle. But against that, I've also put a yellow curve. This is what would have happened if nothing had gone on but fossil fuel burning. So you see that the actual trend is slower. And if you remember what I said before, if you take the trend in fossil fuel burning and the trend in oxygen and correct it for fossil fuel burning, what's left over ought to be mostly a signature of the land biosphere. So something on land is producing oxygen that's partly compensating for the fossil fuel oxygen loss. There's photosynthesis going on land that's producing oxygen that's compensating. So there has to be taking up carbon. So this tells you that the net land effect is in the direction of carbon upward. And so if you go back to the earlier slide here where we looked at these sink processes, you see the residual sink is bigger than the land use. That's the difference between those is the net land. So there's carbon going overall in the direction of the land. The biosphere is becoming more rich in organic matter. So as much as humans are out there slash burning and clearing the land and tilling the soils, carbon is piling up overall. Yeah.
Is there a quick and easy reason that you're excluding marine organic matter?
Yes, because it got complicated. It gets, well.
I mean, you're in a room full of ocean biogeochemists.
Right.
You're saying basically photosynthesis.
See, here's one of these hard hitters that stands up.
Not at all.
No, it's a good question. I get that question all the time, actually. We don't, actually. And in the budgets that we work out with this, we apply a correction. So the ocean biota is also part of a cycle of life. So the fact that there's photosynthesis in the ocean doesn't itself mean that there's likely to be, a net accumulation. After all, and actually in the ocean, you don't actually have a lot of organic matter. Instead of piling up organic matter, what you do is the organisms produce their bodies, or they grow in the upper ocean, and then they'll partly sink or they'll poop, and the poop will sink. But that doesn't pile up as this big sludge blob in the bottom of the ocean. I mean, a forest, it's just, you build up forest soil, but that's not what happens in the ocean. It decomposes in the deep ocean. But that does have the effect of taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and putting it in the deep ocean. So it's that sort of cycle of life that potentially could change. And there's reasons to think that it may change as the planet warms because of increased upper ocean warming. The waters near the upper ocean are warming, and high latitudes are getting fresher. And that can lead to a reduction of the circulation that might actually increase the overall segregation of carbon through that mechanism. And we apply small corrections for that, but it doesn't look like that effect has the same kind of leverage as the land biosphere from any mechanistic estimates I'm aware of. So the simple picture I gave of the ocean doing nothing, ocean biology doing nothing, seems much closer to being correct than a corresponding view of the land. Okay. Questions? Any more hard-hitting questions? No. Okay.
How much of that change in the ocean, in the land sink, is due to the fact we haven't had a whopping El Nino since '98? I mean, you said it emerged last decade. Why isn't it that we just haven't burned it all the way we would normally during a good big El Nino?
Okay, so your question starts with a statement, which I agree with, and that is that during El Nino events, the land kind of switches from being a sink to being neutral or
tropical burning.
Yeah, well, drought and stresses in tropical ecosystems. But I think, even if you look at where you had a few of those El Nino events, these peaks up here, this is probably the 98 El Nino, and I can't even see my scale here very well because of the angle. And this is probably back in the late 80s. So those are El Nino events. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that, other than, we've looked at this decade to decade, and the El Nino signal does seem to have some expression in the decadal variability, but this overall trend is on top of that. I'm not going to dig into the numbers on this, but these estimates of oxygen very much back up the numbers we saw before in the table that I showed you. Also adding to that line of evidence is people looking at the distribution of tracers in the ocean, things like chlorofluorocarbons that give you rates of ocean mixing. That's the main additional constraint, is a constraint on mixing coming from chlorofluorocarbons. So what might be causing this land uptake? And there's basically three ideas on the table, and we don't have a mechanistic understanding that really takes it apart. But one is that, and it's the kind of the obvious one, there's more CO2 in the air. CO2 is a kind of an aerial fertilizer. They use it in greenhouses to make things grow faster. So things are out of whack on land because there's more CO2 in the atmosphere. And it goes under the heading CO2 fertilization. The other thing we're doing is we're fertilizing inadvertently with extra nitrogen. There's nitrogen from combustion that escapes onto the landscape. There's nitrogen from agricultural practices that moves beyond just the areas that are being farmed. And the other thing that's happening, of course, is climate is changing. And climate change could go either way. You could have ecosystems disturbed and losing carbon or gaining carbon, but that's another factor. So some combination of those is evidently at play causing this uptake. Now there's one piece of evidence that helps us, it's actually played a big role in thinking about this land sink, and it has to do with the excess carbon dioxide in the northern hemisphere relative to the southern hemisphere. Now, this is, so if you each one of these is a different station where there's observations, and the data has been detrended, and its difference in an annual mean relative to the South Pole is what's plotted here. And you can see stations in the far north have an excess. This is an estimate around year 2003 of something like 3 or 4 parts per million relative to the southern hemisphere stations. You expect an excess because most fossil fuel burning occurs in the northern hemisphere, and it takes a while for the air to mix into the southern hemisphere. So you expect there to be a kind of steady state excess associated with this continued fossil fuel burning. But if you run the numbers on how much of a difference you expect from fossil fuel burning, taking account of the rates of burning and the rates of atmospheric mixing, you end up with a discrepancy between that gradient and what you observe. And there's a body of work that tends to attribute most of that difference to a land sink acting in the northern extratropics, pulling CO2 out at the same latitude bands where most of the fossil fuel burning is counteracting this effect. So that, and the sink you estimate from that, is of the same order as this residual sink you need globally. So it's as if the tropics aren't part of the sink, it's the northern extratropics. That's a little weird because if CO2 fertilization is part of the mechanism, you'd actually expect more of the fertilization going on at lower latitudes because it actually tends to go a little faster in warmer temperatures. So it's a little bit against what you'd expect from a pure fertilization effect. But there's evidence for that from this gradient. Now I'm going to come back to this story later because we actually have some new evidence from our data that sort of weakens that need for that sink in the north a little bit. And I'll get to that later on. This is the bit that actually has to do with the Southern Ocean a little bit. So our understanding of oceans can help us figure out what's going on land. That's kind of, the poor oceanographers are relegated to doing accounting for people on land. But there's another really intriguing story that's come about in the last decade or two, and it has to do with the seasonal cycle. Now, here's the Mauna Loa record here, shown along with several other records that go back into the early days of these measurements. Now, at Mauna Loa, it goes up and down with season. Why is it doing that? Well, of course, there's a growing season in the summer where there's more carbon being taken out than released, and then in the shoulder seasons, in the spring and the fall, there's not a lot of photosynthesis, but it's still warm enough to support bacterial activity that releases CO2. So you have an imbalance between fall, spring, and summer. In winter, things are much more passive. That's what's driving the cycle. And of course, it's superimposed on the overall rise because the cycle of life is going on as we're adding fossil fuel to the atmosphere. In Mauna Loa, the cycle amplitude, if you look very carefully, you can see the swings are a little bit bigger here than there. They're about 15% bigger. So that's been something people have looked at. But what's much more intriguing is if you look at these stations further north, like Barrow, Alaska, well, particularly Barrow, you see that the amplitude is increased by about 50%. I'm also showing an intriguing record here from La Jolla, where the amplitude's gone up even more. We don't quite understand that, but the Barrow record, anyway, is the one we focused on because it's got a chance of being more widely representative. What's going on with this large increase in this seasonal cycle? And one of the first questions that you ask is this really representative of something large scale, or could this just be some fluke of Barrow? I mean, Barrow's sitting on tundra, and maybe the tundra is right around the station is somehow contaminating the record so that it's not a large-scale measure. So that was one concern about the interpretation of this. And in the last few years, we were able to really tackle this by having new airborne observations that did a massive survey of the atmosphere, almost from pole to pole, at different times of year, that allowed us to see the seasonal cycle today in the far north. And what's fantastic is that a very similar campaign on the same kind of scale was undertaken in the late 1950s at the same time my father was setting up the Mauna Loa Observatory. He didn't really want to do the airborne stuff. He was told he had to. But there's a massive data set of airborne CO2 observations on these weather reconnaissance flights that were flown all across the North Pacific in the late 1950s. And we can compare the cycles that you see in these weather reconnaissance flights with this new so-called HIPPO campaign. And what we found was that this increase you see at Barrow is indeed representative of a large swath of the northern hemisphere atmosphere. Basically, if you go north of about 45 north, you see a cycle that's increased by about 50% over the last 50 years, and that's something like 0.8% per year. That's a really massive change in metabolic activity. Now, what is that? Well, it could be a respiration signal because the shoulder seasons are part of this cycle, or it could be increase in photosynthesis going on in the growing season. But it turns out to be rather hard to get this increase unless you have some kind of fairly significant increase in photosynthesis going on. So it goes along with the idea that you have some kind of northern extratropical sink sucking up carbon overall, but also associated with a more vigorous cycling with season. So where are we headed? One thing about this is there's no real evidence that this amplitude increase has plateaued. It looks like we're heading off into a brave new world. And I point out that that's not too surprising. If you look at the far north today, this is the Arctic slope, you see tundra. All you have to do is go back to the Pliocene, the last time CO2 concentrations were as high as they are now, and when the climate was as warm as it's likely to get pretty soon. You had boreal forests in the same zone. So I think we're at basically what we're seeing here is the beginning, in some likelihood, the beginning of a transition to a very different kind of northern ecosystem. It's not just the Arctic at play, though. To get these cycle changes, it turns out you need amplitude, big swings also in the boreal forest. In fact, the boreal forest is probably the main, so forests like this exist today between about 50 north and about 60 some north. Those forests are changing, and we see it from the atmosphere in a big way. What's interesting is we don't really know what's causing this amplitude change. There are models that have been run, the same models that predict CO2 out into the future, as best people can do it today. They don't get this amplitude change. So they're missing something that's actually happening on the ground. And there's a lot of work trying to figure that out. So this kind of gets back to that question here. So in summary, I think there's evidence that the land biosphere is changing in a really big way already. The investment of thousands of people into this field perhaps is not over the top relative to what's going on. But what about the poor oceans here? What role does the ocean play in uptake of CO2 beyond a passive response to rising CO2? And the conventional wisdom is the role is rather small. And one way to characterize that is to look at the projections of the uptake that are expected as we move into the future under various scenarios of rising CO2. And you can see here's the land uptake. Here's kind of the center of a whole bunch of different models, and this green thing here is the spread in the models. There's a lot of variation across models and what the land's going to be. In other words, we don't know what's going to happen on land. But the spread in the uptake in the oceans is much less, as though we kind of understand it better. So this is part of the reason you might say, okay, the ocean is sort of better understood, at least it looks that way from models. There's another piece of the story here is that if you actually decompose the rise in CO2 finally year by year, and then try to separate that between land and ocean, which you can do to some extent, there's pretty clear evidence that the land is actually responsible for most of the changes in growth rate in the atmosphere from year to year. So this is an estimate of how the flux into the ocean is varying. It's normalized to 0 here just to take out the mean. But you see this green curve is the land, and you see here's an El Nino event. Here was some other weaker El Nino events. So it's following El Nino. This is the point that Joe Ellen was making earlier. The ocean is also varying as far as we can tell, but not by as much. This is not super secure as to how big the ocean signal is, but since it's dominated by the land, we do kind of know how big the land effect is, and we know it's mostly land. So that also suggests that there's more sensitivity to short-term climate of the land than the ocean. On the other hand, we don't have some of the same ability to track the ocean. So I asked this as a kind of a question for the audience. Where is the signature of the ocean in this record? So think about that for a minute. Well, one thing I told you about is that the rise would be higher if the oceans weren't taking up CO2. So one piece of the signature is it's controlling the overall growth rate. But the seasonal cycle here is mostly coming from the land. And the wiggles interannually, year to year, are the things that were reflected on the previous slide. They're also mostly coming from the land. It's very hard to see the ocean driving much of the variation in this record. And what that tells you, it's hard to use atmospheric CO2 to actually probe the oceans because you've got all this noise coming from the land interfering with your ability to see through to the ocean phenomena. It doesn't mean that the ocean couldn't be doing something on longer time scales here that's interesting. It's just very hard to pick out of these records. Now, it turns out we can get another window into ocean phenomena by looking at atmospheric oxygen. So it's a different application than getting this overall long-term trend. So now I put the ocean biota back in this slide here, where it belonged all along, but I took it out to keep it simple. So this is now the main controls. We have fossil fuel burning, we have the land exchanges, we have CO2 going in from ocean uptake, and then we have exchanges involving the surface and deep water, and photosynthesis and air-sea exchange. All of this is driving changes in atmospheric oxygen and in atmospheric CO2. But it turns out that these land exchanges right here are very tightly coupled, almost 1-to-1, so that if you take up a CO2, you give off an oxygen or vice versa. That means if you add the CO2 concentration and the oxygen concentration together, you end up with a combination that's not sensitive to the land anymore. You kind of take it out. And we call that sum atmospheric potential oxygen. It's kind of the amount of oxygen you could have in air if you turned all the CO2 into oxygen by photosynthesis. So it's the potential amount you could have given the amount of CO2. And atmospheric potential oxygen, you kind of take the land out. There's a little effect from fossil fuel burning because fuel, when you burn fuel, you also make water. There's hydrogen in fuel, so some of the oxygen loss is not going in to make carbon dioxide, it's going in to make water. So it's a smaller effect than the overall fossil fuel effect. And then you have these combination of effects that are driving carbon and oxygen across the air-sea interface, driving APO. This is kind of well known, we can correct for it. So this APO tracer ends up being some measure of what's happening with air-sea exchange with the oceans. Now, I want to point out one thing interesting about carbon and oxygen exchange. When plankton grow in the ocean, they're growing on the CO2, but it very quickly equilibrates with the ionic species, bicarbonate and carbonate in the water, such that they're effectively mainly changing the bicarbonate in the water. And bicarbonate is kind of part of the salt of the sea. It's an ion. It's not exchanged across the air-sea interface. So there's rather a sluggish coupling between the growth and the atmosphere because most of the carbon's not coming out of CO2. It's coming out of this salt form. On the other hand, when they make oxygen by photosynthesis, it just goes in as gaseous O2 that's very quickly exchanged. So there's actually more efficient coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere in oxygen than there is in carbon dioxide. And we see that, for example, in the seasonal cycles. So this next slide shows you both oxygen trends on the top and carbon dioxide trends here on the bottom at two of the stations in our network. And you see this seasonal cycle in carbon dioxide here in black, that's in the northern hemisphere, That's alert, but it's a little like the Mauna Loa record. And then you have a red record here, which is another record in the southern hemisphere. Why isn't there very much of a seasonal cycle in the southern hemisphere? It's because in the southern hemisphere, you don't have boreal forests, you have ocean. So the latitudes where you have boreal forests in the northern hemisphere, you've got oceans in the southern hemisphere. And although they're plankton in the ocean, and they're drawing carbon out of the water by photosynthesis just like they are on land, that deficit isn't communicated to the air because of this buffering chemistry. On the other hand, if you look at the southern hemisphere station, Cape Grim, you do see this substantial cycle in oxygen. So this is the oxygen mainly breathing out of the ocean seasonally. And if you look at alert, where you have a substantial land signal in the northern hemisphere, you have an even bigger signal in oxygen. That's because you have a combined oxygen and CO2 signal. But if you sum the oxygen and CO2 to get APO, you still have cycles. And these cycles are mostly reflecting oxygen exchange with the ocean seasonally. And so this is the northern hemisphere cycle and the southern hemisphere cycle. So this is starting to look a little bit like the Mauna Loa seasonal cycle. The Mauna Loa seasonal cycle is telling you about land, or the barrel cycle was telling you about land processes. This APO cycle is potentially telling us about ocean metabolic activity. And whereas we saw this massive increase in the amplitude in CO2, do we see anything comparable here in the amplitude change? Hard to tell. So in the next slide, I kind of took out the trend and plotted it again as monthly values. We've looked at this, and except for a few big years in the beginning of the Cape Grim record, which seem to probably have to do with a volcanic eruption around that time, we don't really see any evidence of trend. So it kind of supports the view that the oceans may be sort of moving forward into this brave new world without as much change, at least in the open ocean so far. On the other hand, I would point out that we simply don't have the same kind of records of the ocean that we have in the land biosphere. Yeah.
So are these somehow corrected for, you said there was an APO effect from fossil fuel burning. Are those corrected in here?
Yeah, good question. So all these are is they're detrended. And the fossil fuel effect is mostly affecting the trend.
Okay.
So it got subtracted there. This fossil fuel doesn't drive a seasonal cycle anyway to a significant degree. So it didn't have to be corrected beyond that. Okay, so APO, tricky topic. I'm going to get even trickier now. So sorry. This is where I'm trying to do something that the hard-hitting experts might perk up on. But this is going to be a tough one because I never tried to do this before. So this airborne HIPPO campaign, where we measured CO2 all over slices north-south, we also measured oxygen, which is to say we could measure oxygen and CO2 and measure APO. We measured at different times of year so that we could actually measure the annual mean APO in a slice from north to south, almost from the North Pole to the South Pole. So the next slide is going to show that slice, both from the observations. This is up here. And this is an estimate of what it might be from a calculation. I'll say a little bit more about it, but it's a calculation that takes account of the circulation of the ocean and the distribution of tracers in the ocean to try to estimate what it should be. So what do you see here? The interesting thing is that there's less APO in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere on average, and you see it throughout the column. Now, partly you expect a deficit in the north because fossil fuel burning does, it turns out, consume a little more oxygen than it does release CO2. That projects onto APO. That's part of this, but that's accounted for here as well. So what else is going on? Well, the land biosphere got taken out. That's what the APO tracer, the sum canceled the land biosphere. So what's left is ocean transports of oxygen and CO2. So what this is telling you is that the oceans are taking in some kind of combination of oxygen and CO2 in the northern hemisphere, and they're pumping it out in the southern hemisphere. There's an asymmetry in what the oceans are doing. There's kind of a gas pump. The oceans are pumping gas from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere in a kind of natural cycle. And we simulate that using this model for the physical circulation, taking account of the tracers in the ocean, and we don't get as big an effect in the model. Now, I want to point out now that we have been able to show that the transport of this tracer, this APO tracer, in this way, is almost certainly very closely tied to the interhemispheric transport of heat by the ocean. And one way to see that that's likely to be the case is to look at tracers in the ocean itself. So you can go in the water, you can measure a bunch of stuff, and you can do it all over the world at different depths. And then you can come back and put it all in an XY plot that confuses the public, but maybe not the experts. So I apologize for those of you who don't want to look at this. But what I'm showing here is potential temperature at a whole bunch of points in the ocean, different depths, different latitudes, different longitudes. Each one of these points is some place and some depth in the ocean. And over here is a weird combination of tracers in the ocean, but I don't have time to explain this. This combination of tracers should mimic whether the water has gained or lost APO from the atmosphere. And so this tracer is, as you can see, very strongly correlated to potential temperature. That means that the air sea fluxes that drive changes in this should be very closely associated with the air sea fluxes that drive changes in potential temperature, which is namely heat loss or gain. So we expect association with heat. Now, the calculation we did with the ECHO model, we repeated with a series of other ocean models. We're only relying on the ocean model for the physical transport. We use the actual ocean tracer data to try to infer fluxes. It's kind of an inverse calculation where you use the transports and then the distribution to infer the best fit for the fluxes at the surface. And here's a series of models. Some of these models are pretty crude and pretty far from reality. So the main thing, this is a complicated slide, but what I want you to focus on here is these points here. Each one of these is a measure of the interhemispheric difference in APO. So what's plotted there for each model is the difference between a box here and a box here. They're averages. So it's an attempt to capture this hemispheric asymmetry as depicted by the ocean models. And here is a similar estimate of the interhemispheric transport of heat using the same tracer approach using potential temperature data. And you can see they are very strongly correlated across these different models. The only thing different between these points is a different assumption about how the ocean is circulating. And we don't know exactly how the ocean circulation goes. These models are crude, and there's attempts to do better. But we do see that these points scattered along here. None of them, however, get an interhemispheric difference as big as the 8 per meg deficit we see in the observations.
But isn't heat goes from south to north, opposite to CO2 or APO?
Yeah, well, exactly right. So thanks for that question. So the idea here is that you can almost understand it as if cold water holds more gas than warm water. So the sense of this can be understood with nothing more than that premise. Now, it's holding a combination of oxygen and CO2, and there's biology involved. It's very complicated. But if you take that premise, if you have water that comes up in the southern hemisphere, and it takes up heat in the southern hemisphere, that means it's going to be warming in the southern hemisphere, therefore releasing gas in the southern hemisphere. Then the water flows north somehow. In the northern hemisphere, the water cools off, which is to say it takes up gas. But if it's cooling off, it's releasing heat to the air. So the heat is being pumped from south to north. The gases are being pumped from north to south. So it's exactly right. Okay. So there's a failure of these models to account for the actual APO deficit. And you might project these, and we can do this and say, okay, maybe the true interhemispheric heat transport is something like 7 petawatts. And here's an estimate from the WOS transect. It's a big error bars. All of this is kind of within the WOS spread. The ECHO model is sitting right here. It's sort of closer to the reality than some of the others, but it's not outside the envelope of sort of poor behavior, you might say. So what does this relate to? I realize I'm about out of time, but I'm almost there. This relates to the story of the northern terrestrial carbon sink and the interhemispheric gradient. So let's go back to this slide. Okay, this is the excess CO2 in the northern hemisphere. This is the observed gradient. And here's the gradient you expect from fossil fuel burning. Now, conventionally, the oceans don't do much to affect the gradient through their natural flow, although there is another effect with the uptake of anthropogenic CO2, which I don't have much time to talk about. But the interpretation of this as a land sink kind of hinges on the ocean not being a strong pump of CO2 from one hemisphere to the other. or at least the sink is usually estimated assuming that's the case. That's sort of the conventional school of thought. But before that school of thought developed, my father, he comes back into the story, sorry, had a kind of different school of thought. And his school of thought was maybe the oceans is a pretty big pump of carbon from north to south, and that's partly explaining this. And we think the APO data actually adds some weight to his way of looking at it. So that's the main punchline here. So what he had done is he looked at how this gradient evolved with time. So this is the gradient, these blue points, circa 2003. But thanks to all the work that was done early on with carbon dioxide measurements on ships and so forth, here's what the pattern actually looked like in around 1962. There's a bulge at low latitudes having to do with upwelling. These were Pacific data, so this is another story. But we're not focused on this bulge here. We're focused on, this is an ocean phenomenon. The ocean's outgassing at low latitude. We're focused on the difference between the hemispheres, so the difference between these latitudes and those latitudes. And at this time, there was a really very weak gradient. Now, of course, there was less fossil fuel burning then, so that makes sense. You didn't have as much fossil fuel burning going on. And then you can see it building up. Here's the gradient in 1968. Here's the gradient in 1980. And then, of course, we have the one more recently. But if you take those gradients and how they evolve with time, and you take account of the amount of fossil fuel burning, you can actually do a linear regression between the excess and the fossil fuel burning, and you can project back to zero fossil fuel burning. What would the gradient have been? It's a kind of hypothetical pre-industrial gradient before there's any fossil fuel burning. And that's what that gradient looks like according to that kind of calculation. So it's a significant chunk of what you need to explain this northern deficit. Now this way of looking at things, as I said, has mostly been kind of ignored by the community. It's been ignored in part because there's another way of doing this involving CO2 data in the upper ocean, PCO2 data, that kind of gives a little bit different story, although there's probably ways that the two can be blended. So we have a and a lot of the studies that interpret this northern sink use the same kind of inverse calculation that we just did with the WOS model for APO, but they do it just for CO2. And so this relates then to this slide here that I showed already with the heat transport and the APO, but you can do something similar where you actually put the interhemispheric transport of carbon dioxide, which we can also diagnose from the models. And that's what that looks like. So this is the same models in these points here. The y-axis is the same as the last plot. And here's the sort of pre-industrial CO2 gradient you'd expect. These models fail to get the same CO2 gradient that you infer from this extrapolation back in the same kind of way that they fail to get the APO gradient right. Now the correlation between APO and CO2 isn't that good. Okay, so you can't really project this and say, but what the point here is that you see similar kinds of discrepancies. And so if you believe that the APO is a more reliable measure, you say, okay, there's something wrong with these models, and said, okay, yeah, it's probably not getting CO2 right either, although you wouldn't really know how to project that from the CO2 alone. So anyway, it adds weight to the notion that the oceans are doing this. So something about the ocean circulation is more asymmetric than shows up in these different models. One of the obvious deficiencies is that the models have trouble getting enough heat transport by the Atlantic overturning circulation, the meridional overturning circulation. It's possible also they don't get some things right in the differences between the Indo-Pacific circulation. So, and in fact, some of these, if you go back to this slide here, you see this sort of interesting deep deficit right here. This is almost certainly associated with strong fluxing over the Western Pacific in the wintertime. It shows up in the wintertime data. So there's a lot of uptake of oxygen in the Western Pacific in the wintertime. This is a part of the atmosphere that's deeply convective because it's right in the middle of the storm track in the wintertime. So this signal gets spread way up in the atmosphere. So even though we didn't fly in the Western Pacific, we could see it in the hippo tracks. And probably something similar is going on in the Atlantic. But anyway, the Indo-Pacific does seem to be part of this pattern that we see here. So that's pretty much all I was going to say. I want to stop on one kind of more programmatic note. I want to draw a contrast. So in this talk, I sort of drew a contrast between the land biosphere showing all this interesting activity, the ocean biosphere sort of looking like it might be sort of coming through okay. But there's a similar kind of strange difference between how the communities think about these problems. And I would argue that this difference is maybe not all that well warranted. So there's kind of contrasting paradigms for the research community. The land, a lot of research is going on because of the notion of the monetization of sinks. These sinks may have commercial value and processes that are not understood. And the interesting thing is the community looks at CO2 fertilization as a benefit. Never mind the fact that if an ecosystem is taking up carbon, it's changing. It's being impacted. So you don't have people going out there and saying, hey, what harm is going to be caused by this forest soaking up carbon? That question isn't even on the table. And yet the ecosystem is in some kind of unnatural state. There's probably winners and losers in terms of species that are gaining or losing because of something shifted. You can imagine havoc going on the land. The community's not looking at that. They're saying, oh, CO2 fertilization. They're seeing dollar signs or something. Okay, so what's going on in the ocean? There's no kind of monetization. There's a hands-off approach. Basically, the ocean is kind of this international waters that nobody can touch. You can't even put a ton of CO2 in, or you're against the law of the sea. There's sort of strange, sort of illogical barriers to actually viewing it as something. People have thought of iron fertilization and these other things to try to get CO2 out, but it's been tricky territory for anyone to venture into. And then you don't see CO2 effects on the ecosystem as a benefit. You see it as an agent of harm. It's called ocean acidification. So on the land, we have CO2 fertilization. In the ocean, we have ocean acidification. And yet, what's happening in both cases is the ecosystems are probably going to be perturbed by this additional gas in ways where there's winners and losers. It doesn't seem like there should be this completely different way of looking about these systems. I didn't talk about ocean acidification in this talk, but I assume most of you heard about it. It's the notion that many organisms won't grow their shells as well and other things because of the decline of the carbonate ion. There's a lot of reason for concern about that. I would just point out that there's probably a lot of reason for concern that the organisms on land aren't going to be able to compete in a high CO2 world because something else is growing faster. Aren't we worried about that too? Don't know. Anyway, so thank you.